On the 9th of October 1781, George Washington personally fired the first shot at Yorktown. In doing so, he symbolically began the last great battle of the American Revolutionary War. The largest British field army in America, under General Charles Cornwallis, had entrenched itself in the town, and Washington had marched south to confront and destroy them. The siege of Yorktown was characterized by a devastating bombardment, perfect timing, and a spectacular assault. It is considered George Washington's greatest military success, and the decisive battle of the American Revolutionary War. In spring of 1781, America was in a difficult situation. Public support for the war was waning, American currency was almost worthless, and the poorly supplied and underpaid Continental Army was on the verge of mutiny. At the same time, several British armies were threatening the southern states, and Henry Clinton, the British commander-in-chief, was firmly entrenched in New York. George Washington, who had been commander-in-chief of the American troops for over 5 years, was aware of the seriousness of the situation. Quote, "We are at the end of our tether. Now or never, our deliverance must come." If the campaign of 1781 did not bring results, the American struggle for independence would be in grave danger. Washington's plan for the 1781 campaign season was to attack New York, the center of British power in America. This was possible because reinforcements had arrived from Allied France the year before. The Count of Rochambeau had led around 5,500 men to America and was now ready for a joint operation at Newport. On top of that, the French managed to send a second fleet under Admiral de Grasse in the spring of 1781. It was headed for the West Indies, but if all went well, it would sail north after completing its mission and support Washington and Rochambeau. On the 22nd of May 1781, the two generals met in Wethersfield, Connecticut, to plan the joint campaign. Washington did not want to rely on de Grasse to arrive on time and stuck to his plan to attack New York. Rochambeau, on the other hand, believed in his compatriot and thought the Allies could achieve more in the south, where General Cornwallis had united several smaller British contingents and threatened Virginia with over 7,000 men. Washington prevailed. The Allied forces reached New York in July. As expected, the British had made good use of the last 3 years and had solidly fortified the city. For over a month, Washington searched for a way to take Manhattan. He still had not found one when news arrived on the 14th of August that de Grasse had left the West Indies with 29 ships and 3,200 soldiers and was on his way to Virginia. However, the admiral announced that he would have to return to France before the onset of winter and therefore must sail again by mid-October at the latest. This gave the Allies only about 2 months to exploit their superiority. Washington faced probably the most important decision of his military career. Should he remain in his strong position in New York or risk a forced march south and put all his eggs in one basket? The risk was enormous. No one could say whether Cornwallis would still be there when the Allies arrived, and there was no guarantee the French fleet would get there in time, if it arrived at all. Nevertheless, Washington decided to seize the opportunity. Before diving into the siege, I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsor CyberGhost VPN, which has over 38 million users worldwide and an excellent rating on Trustpilot. A VPN is one of the most essential tools when browsing the internet. It ensures your online activity remains private and inaccessible to prying eyes. A VPN masks your IP address and routes all your traffic through a secure VPN tunnel, which makes tracking your actions impossible. But CyberGhost offers more than just privacy protection. It also unlocks access to over 40 major streaming platforms like Netflix, Amazon Prime, and Disney+. Streaming services often restrict their catalogs based on your location, meaning certain shows or movies may be unavailable in some countries. With CyberGhost, you can easily change your virtual location. For example, this show here is not available in my country, but it is available in the United States. With CyberGhost, you can easily change your virtual location, giving you access to any content, regardless of your location. Plus, you'll never have to worry about being blocked from your favorite shows when you travel. Security is a top priority for CyberGhost. They have a strict no-logs policy, meaning they never track or store any user data. With servers across 100 countries, you'll always have a fast, reliable, and secure connection. CyberGhost is incredibly user-friendly, works seamlessly across all major platforms from Windows, iOS and Android to gaming consoles, Linux and Smart TV. You can try CyberGhost VPN risk-free with their 45-day money-back guarantee. Plus, by using my link, you can get CyberGhost at an incredible 84% discount, just $2.10 a month, with 4 months free. The Allies marched off on the 19th of August. Around 4,000 French soldiers and 3,000 Continentals moved south overland, while Admiral de Barras transported supplies, material and artillery along the coast in 9 ships. Under no circumstances could Clinton find out what the Allies were up to. Otherwise, he could have sent reinforcements to Virginia or warned Cornwallis. Washington, therefore, tried to convince him that New York was still his target. He leaked some forged letters to Clinton, had his troops feign preparations for a siege, and chose the march route as if he wanted to attack New York from the south. His plan worked. It took a long time for the British to realize what was happening. Meanwhile, Cornwallis marched northeast, closely followed by a much smaller American force under the Marquis de Lafayette, a French officer who had joined the Continental Army. Cornwallis was tasked with building a fortified base and damaging the rebels' economic and military infrastructure in Virginia. Lafayette harassed the British where he could and followed them as they turned east in late July. On the 30th of August, he reported to Washington that the enemy went round to Yorktown. Cornwallis did precisely what Washington had hoped for. The Allies quickly continued to Head of Elk, where they scraped together all available boats and embarked for Jamestown. De Grasse reached the Chesapeake Bay in late August. He immediately dispatched more transport boats to Head of Elk, sent his troops to help Lafayette pin down Cornwallis at Yorktown, and blocked the bay with his ships. Meanwhile, Clinton sent Admiral Thomas Graves with 19 warships to Virginia to put the French to flight. His squadron overtook de Barras just off the Chesapeake Bay and approached the estuary on the 5th of September. The British assumed de Grasse had left at least half of his fleet in the Caribbean and that the 19 ships would easily suffice to secure control of the bay. Graves was stunned when 24 ships of the line and 5 frigates emerged from the Chesapeake Bay and formed up for battle. Soon, a storybook naval battle raged, allowing de Barras, who had also arrived in the meantime, to slip into the bay unhampered. According to the historian John Ferling, the Battle of the Chesapeake technically ended in a draw, but was strategically decisive. Graves was forced to admit that he was inferior to the Allied fleet and withdrew to New York, giving up any chance of supporting Yorktown by sea. Washington, who had briefly separated from his troops to visit Mount Vernon, his home, which he hadn't seen in more than 6 years, reached Williamsburg on the 14th of September. He was greeted as if he had already won the war. The French gave a banquet, and the tempestuous Lafayette, who had not seen his commander-in-chief for almost a year, quote, absolutely kissed him from ear to ear. There was good reason to celebrate. For the first time in Washington's military career, everything had gone entirely according to plan. The French had actually arrived. Cornwallis was where he was supposed to be, and almost all the British troops in the south were sitting in a heap. The chances of inflicting a crushing defeat on them were better than ever. While the Allies celebrated, Cornwallis realized he was trapped. Although his officers urged him to break out as long as he only had to deal with Lafayette's troops, he decided to stay. After the Battle of the Chesapeake, it was unlikely that support would come from New York, but Cornwallis still hoped to ride the siege out. He had enough supplies, knew the French fleet would have to abandon its blockade sooner or later, and hoped Clinton would find another way to help him, he was also aware that the war was at a turning point. According to Ferling, quote, "If a worst-case scenario materialized, he did not wish to be saddled with blame for Britain's failure." On the 17th of September, Cornwallis wrote to the High Command in New York, quote, "I do not think myself justifiable in putting the fate of the war on so desperate an attempt as an attack on Lafayette's troops." 3 days later, Washington sent an advance guard to Gloucester to prevent the British from leaving Yorktown in that direction. Now it was too late to break out. Shortly after, the last transportation ships with French troops, artillery, and siege equipment arrived in Jamestown. Now 7,800 French soldiers, 3,100 militiamen, and 8,000 Continentals were ready to crush Cornwallis and his 9,000 redcoats. On the 28th of September, they marched the last few miles to Yorktown. The siege had begun. The Allies' biggest concern was the ticking clock. During a visit to his flagship, Washington and Rochambeau convinced de Grasse to stay until the end of October, but he refused to stay a single day longer. This was a problem because once the French ships were gone, the British could again reach their troops at Yorktown by sea and easily resupply and reinforce them. So Washington had only 6 weeks to complete his mission, and it was not an easy one. Cornwallis had fortified Yorktown carefully. Since they had established themselves in Yorktown in August, the British troops had built several outposts, most importantly a chain of 7 fortified positions and 6 batteries. In addition, a well-protected gun emplacement at Gloucester Point, a promontory on the opposite bank, dominated the River York. Rochambeau, the only Allied commander with siege experience, immediately realized that the fortifications were too strong to be overrun, and time was too short to starve Yorktown into submission. The only option was a formal siege. This involved approaching the enemy using trenches to dig him out shovel by shovel, as one American soldier put it. This was a very safe but also very slow method to conquer a fortified place, and time was of the essence. On the 29th of September, the Allies moved closer to the defensive lines. The British greeted them with a thunderous barrage, but caused only minor damage. The following night, Cornwallis withdrew all his troops from the outer fortifications, except for Fusiliers Redoubt and Redoubts No. 9 and 10. In doing so, he gave up a lot of ground and valuable time, but he also tightened his lines. This was a risk, but it made sense, because now the defenders only had to occupy the defenses next to the town, which meant they could save their strength. The Allies immediately took possession of the abandoned positions, and used them to build their own fortifications. On the 5th of October, the Allies opened the first parallel. When the French led a divisionary attack against Fusiliers Redoubt, under the cover of the dark, rainy night, the Americans opened the trenches with a small ceremony. Barely half a kilometer from Redoubts No. 9 and 10, Washington did the honors and, quote, struck a few blows with a pickaxe, that it might be said General Washington, with his own hands, first broke ground at the siege of Yorktown. The American troops then set to work, closely guided by the experienced French engineers. Night after night, the men toiled away in the sun-baked Virginia soil until all the gun emplacements were finally completed on the 9th of October. Again, there was a ceremony in which Washington personally put the match to the first gun. When his deadly salute faded, almost 100 guns joined in, generating an ear-splitting noise. The bombardment had begun. Over the next few weeks, almost 3,600 shells rained down on tiny Yorktown every single day. Their effect was enormous. Within a very short time, rubble and corpses were strewn everywhere. The harbor was a mess, and there was hardly any cover left. Cornwallis had to retreat to a simple earthen bunker, and many of his men only survived by hiding in semi-collapsed cellars or taking cover under riverbank overhangs. While conditions in the town became more precarious every day, the trenches inched ever closer. On the 14th of October, the Allies began building the second parallel. which would only be fully effective when it stretched all the way down to the river. However, two obstacles prevented this: redoubts number 9 and 10. To complete the second parallel, these two outposts had to be stormed first. This was a risky task, as the massive earthen fortifications, about 130 meters apart, were surrounded by muddy trenches, fronted by several rings of abatis, a barrier of tree trunks and sharpened branches. The defenders had entrenched themselves behind sturdy palisades and stood ready with their weapons loaded and bayonets fixed. The assault troops were in for a bloody fight. After dusk, 400 French soldiers advanced against number 9, and the same number of Americans against number 10. They waited in the trenches until the French began a divisionary attack on the Fusiliers' redoubt, and then silently approached the redoubts. The men were fully aware that they were about to enter the last and decisive fight of this battle, perhaps of the entire war. Their weapons were not loaded, but their bayonets were fixed. They had almost reached the entrenchment when a guard spotted them and sounded the alarm. Suddenly, loud orders echoed through the air, and signal rockets cast a flickering light on the scene. The two assault parties reached the redoubts almost simultaneously. The French laboriously worked their way through the entrenchment, making slow progress at first and suffering heavy casualties. Despite all obstacles, they fought their way to the trench, broke through the palisades, and stormed up the earthen rampart. By the time they entered the redoubt, they had suffered 15 dead and 77 wounded. Still, they were clearly superior in numbers, and the garrison immediately laid down their arms. At number 9, the Americans had their sappers destroy the entrenchment before advancing. They then surrounded the redoubt and attacked from all sides simultaneously. After a short battle in which both sides fought fiercely with bayonets, fists and tools, redoubt number 10 was in Allied hands as well. With these obstacles eliminated, nothing could stop the Allies from completing their second parallel and moving closer to the city. Recognizing the desperate situation, Cornwallis ordered a daring foray for the next night. Under darkness, 350 hand-picked soldiers launched an assault against the advanced Allied positions. Thanks to the element of surprise, they managed to quickly destroy several guns, but then failed to gain a foothold. After a short while, a French unit made an appearance and drove them back to Yorktown. It was the first and only sortie of the entire siege. The next day, the mood in the Allied camp was almost boisterous. The French and American gunners competed against each other, vying for the best shot and greatest damage. The other side found this less amusing. For Cornwallis and his men, quote, "there was nothing to be seen but bombs and cannonballs raining down." Nevertheless, the defenders did not admit to defeat. After dark, Cornwallis tried to escape the trap. He ordered his men to cross the York and evacuate to Gloucester Point, but the attempted retreat did not get far. When about a third of the troops had reached the other shore, a violent storm swept over the river and prevented any more men from crossing. This failed attempt at escape clearly bears the marks of a general who knew he was defeated and would soon have to justify his actions before a court-martial in England. Even if the river crossing had succeeded, the British would have had little chance of breaking through the Allied blockade. On the morning of the 17th of October 1781, the Allied barrage was particularly dense. A deafening artillery orchestra played for 3 hours, until at about 10 a.m., an officer waving a white rag appeared on the defenses. He was blindfolded and led to Washington's headquarters, where he presented a letter with Cornwallis's terms of surrender. Negotiations began shortly afterward. Both sides sought a quick agreement. Washington would not risk his long-anticipated victory with minor details, and Cornwallis knew he could not expect any more from his men. On the 19th of October, they both signed a surrender treaty. Over 8,000 of Cornwallis's men became prisoners of war, and the artillery was handed over to the victors. Thus, the last operational British field army in America ceased to exist. The last major battle of the American Revolutionary War was decided. With the siege of Yorktown, the main fighting of the war ended, and the British government was forced to enter negotiations to end the conflict. The news spread like wildfire. The young American nation rejoiced, and one soldier observed that, quote, every American present threw his cocked hat up in the air and shouted, "America is ours."